I want to start this series by telling you what it is not. It is not a debate. It is not a defense of men. It is not an attack on women. And it is definitely not another episode in the tired, circular loop of online gender war that has somehow become the default soundtrack of our digital spaces. Because I'm exhausted by that. I think you are too. And that's probably part of the reason you're here. I identify as a humanist and as someone who is genuinely deeply invested in the work of returning to what is ours, our history, our philosophy, our actual social architecture, not as vibes or nostalgia, but as a way of making sense of the present, making sense of today, of carrying truth into our collective future, of reclaiming identities that were at some point taken from us and replaced with something else wearing our clothes. This topic, gender, tradition, power, African men and women, and how we relate, is one I have felt moved to speak on time and time again. But every time I thought about how to frame it, I became tired. Not from a lack of something to say, but from the thought of how quickly conversations like this get swallowed, how fast they collapse into the same shallow, toxic discourse that clogs our social media feeds every day. So I sat with it and I asked myself, what if I don't enter the debates? What if instead I just ask a different question, a deeper one? What if the question isn't who's right, but whether any of what we're fighting about is even real, even ours? That shift from argument to inquiry is what the series is built on. When I scroll through social media, when I engage those spaces where our people are talking to and at each other about gender, about tradition, about relationships, I see two very loud, very forceful voices. On one side, voices I'll call the hyper-feminist position. A response, and it is a response, let me be clear, to a very real, very oppressive patriarchal system. The voices that name the harm going on within those systems, but that in their expression on these platforms have sometimes hardened into something else. A stance of hostility, a flattening of all men into brutish characters, a kind of gender segregation that circles back to the same binary it claims to reject. On the other side, voices are called the hyper-patriarchal position, defenders of what they genuinely believe is ancient, sacred African tradition. Voices that will go to war to preserve gender roles they see as the bedrock of our culture, roles that give structure, meaning, order. And here is what I want to say to both of them with full respect and without dismissing either. You are both fighting over a house that someone else built, and neither of you has checked who wrote the blueprints. Because the patriarchal system, the one being defended as African tradition, is not in its most present form indigenous to us. It was imposed. It was reinforced. It was written into law by the same colonial structures that also, by the way, tried to destroy every African institution that didn't serve their interests. And it has since been absorbed, reproduced, and passed down within our own families and communities until it feels like it came from our ancestors. It didn't, or at least not in the form that we're defending it. And the feminist response in its most toxic social media iteration is also not a return to African women's ancestral power and freedom. It is its own imported framework. In this case, a particular strand of Western online feminism being worn as some sort of liberation. The real story, the true shape of how indigenous African men and women were designed to coexist, is something neither camp is remembering. It is something that honored both the masculine and the feminine, not as ranks in a hierarchy, but as energies in a system that needed both to function. That is what this series is going back to find. Welcome. Now, I'll be honest with you because if I'm asking you to interrogate your own assumptions, I need to be willing to do the same out loud. In my own life, I have personally experienced what it feels like when people read your body as non-conforming and call it un-African. I have a few tattoos, a nose ring. I keep my hair short and natural. I don't always dress in ways that match what some people imagine as a traditional woman or a traditional African woman to look like. But here's the thing. When I think about my ancestors, the matriarchs, the women before me, I don't picture women who were small or covered up or silenced. When I look at the historical photographs, the old images that have survived, I see women with an extraordinary sense of identity. Women who express themselves vastly and authentically. Women who carry the spirit of their entire community in their presentation. Some of them adorned, decorated in body arts. Hairstyles that till today command attention even in those old black and white photographs. Expressions of self that weren't apologetic. They were declarations. And they were celebrated by their communities, by the men around them. Because it is said, and I believe it, that the woman transmits the culture of her people. She carries it, she passes it on. That kind of responsibility demands full, authentic expression, not a diminished version of herself that's been edited down by someone else's idea of what she should look like. The constraints on how an African woman expresses herself aesthetically, personally, socially, those constraints are not ancestral. They arrived with patriarchy. A patriarchy that, as we'll explore in this series, was itself an import. For me personally, within my immediate family, I was fortunate. I was given the freedom to grow into myself. But I also know I felt those invisible borders the moment I stepped outside that home. Through school, through the wider social world, through all the systems that were subtly teaching me a different version of what I was supposed to be. That gap between what I was permitted to be at home and what the outside world tried to shape me into is the gap this series navigates. So here's what we're going to get into across the 3 episodes that followed this one. The first episode is called Fractured Erasure, and it's going to take us back to the moment, the specific historical moment, when African women's political power was deliberately dismantled. Not because it didn't exist, but because the men who arrived on our shores with law books and Bibles simply refused to deal with it. We're going to talk about what that power actually looked like before it was taken apart and what that erasure has left in its place. The second episode is about something I find genuinely beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. It's called cosmic complementarity, and it goes into the philosophy, the way our ancestors actually understood gender. Not as a ladder with someone at the top and someone at the bottom, but as a balance. 2 forces that needed each other to make the whole thing work. And how that philosophy was systematically replaced by colonial law, by imported religion, with something that only ever had a winner and a loser. And the third episode is one I've been most eager and also most afraid to make. It's called the weaponization of tradition. And it goes directly at the dishonesty, the intellectual dishonesty of using, quote, African culture as a shield to justify something that isn't even African. We're going to trace exactly where that tradition comes from and how it travels through our music, our films, our social media, and what it would actually mean to return to something real. 3 conversations, no guests, just me and you. I'm not here to tell you which side is right or wrong. I'm not here to pander to any team. I'm here because I need us, genuinely need us to ask a more honest question. Not who wins this argument, but is this argument even built on something true? Before we defend the tradition, let's find out who wrote it. By the time this series is done, I want you to look at whatever you believe about gender, about what tradition says about gender, about the roles your culture has given you, and I want you to ask yourself, where does this actually come from? Not from someone's theory, not from what I'm saying, but from your honest reflection. Is what you believe grounded in something you've lived or witnessed? Something traceable to the history of your people, to the spirits you're carrying forward? Or is it something you inherited without anyone ever checking where it came from? That question, I want it to stay with you. This is the Afromanjaro Sessions, Series 1, Stolen Frameworks. Episode 1 drops next week, and we're going all the way back to find out what was there before the world told us who to be to ourselves, and who to be to each other. I'll see you there.